All right. Good morning, everybody. It's 10 o'clock on Tuesday. Thanks for joining for our first of 3 parts of growing grapes in Colorado. And I'm Christine Prinz. I am the Master Gardener Coordinator on the Western Slope in Grand Junction, Montrose, Delta, and Ouray. And I have the pleasure of hosting this 3-part webinar series. And today we have Miranda Ulmer. She just started with CSU Extension in June of 2019, and mostly she does outreach for grape growers across the state. She graduated from Oregon State University in March 2019, where she studied horticulture under Dr. Patty Skinks, the OSU Viticulture Extension Specialist and Professor. Her thesis was focused on pruning practices for Pinot Noir grapes. Other fun things, she grew up in Indiana. She likes working on houses, and every once in a while gets out on the river and does some paddle boarding. So before I hand it over to Miranda, I'm just going to ask that everybody on the webinar could please mute yourself. And if you have a question, go ahead and please type it into the chat box, and we will get to them as they come up. And at the end, Miranda's going to ask if you want to be added to her newsletter. So if you want to type your email into the chat box, we can get you added onto that. So go ahead and take it away, Miranda.
Awesome. Thanks, Christine. I'm so excited I feel like I'm doing my part during the quarantine. And I thank you all for taking the time out of your days, whether you have many Zoom sessions going on or if this is one of your first times logging in. Thanks for being here. And if you are a commercial grape grower, or you just have one grape in your backyard, or you're just interested in grapes in Colorado in general, thank you so much for taking the time to be here today. So I'm gonna start by going over the history of grape growing. We'll talk about the world and the US a little bit, but the majority of this presentation focuses on Colorado specifically. That in mind, we'll talk about the grape growing regions in our state and some statistics. We'll talk about also why growing grapes in Colorado is very unique, and we'll talk about the people, places, and partners involved in grapes in Colorado. And then we will touch on the life cycle of the grapevine just a little bit, and that will help us talk about a few of the limitations that we have for grape growing in Colorado. And then there will be a number of ways that you can stay in touch with what's going on in the grape world, as well as some resources if you're interested in learning more. So thanks again. I just wanted to start out giving us a perspective. The US is about 5th in terms of wine grape growing in the world. And here is an image of the number of wineries in the country in 1937. So a small dot represents 10 wineries and a large dot represents 500. And we're gonna just transition through the decades here. On the next image, you'll see how things changed in the 60s. Again, this is wineries, but we're assuming that would be a little bit of a reflection of the number of vineyards. So keep that in mind, this is wineries. And then we did have prohibition in there. As we transition to the 80s, you can see wineries popping up around the state in different areas. And then by 2013, which is the most recent on this map, you can see that the wine industry kind of exploded there. And if you zoom in on Colorado, you can actually see, again, you were looking at more so wineries in the Denver region, but then on the Western Slope, that's definitely indicative of the vineyard population increasing there. When we're talking, this is all with respect to wine grapes, but grapes are grown for other reasons as well, such as for juice grapes and jam and jelly grapes and raisins. With respect to the US, when we're thinking of jelly and jam grapes, Washington and New York are pretty popular for that, and raisins are commonly grown in California. With respect to Colorado, well, let's back up a little bit. The number of vineyards in each state, the top 5 states in terms of producing vineyards in the US, California is number 1 by far, followed by Washington, Oregon, and New York kind of compete for that 3rd spot, and then Michigan is usually that 5th spot. So Colorado's not up in the running for number 1 by far, but we are a growing industry. And actually the first wine production in Colorado was recorded in 1890, and it was by George A. Crawford, who actually founded Grand Junction. So the first wine was produced on the western slope. Over the next 2 decades, there was an increase in grape production throughout the state. You can see some of the numbers there. However, Prohibition in the Grand Valley came a little early and put a halt to the growing grape and wine industry. However, this did lead to the beginnings of the peach industry, especially in western Colorado, or Palisade to be even more specific. It wasn't until 1970 that grapes were reintroduced into the Grand Valley. But fast forward to today, in last year, there are about 800 vineyard acres throughout the entire state. What's interesting is that they're not only increasing in number, but in their distribution as well. We're not only growing grapes in the Grand Valley, but all across the Four Corners regions. And we'll talk a little bit more about those specific regions in a little bit. But the median vineyard size in our state is about 2.9 acres. However, there are a ton of vineyards that are a lot smaller than that, and a few that are a little bit bigger. So keep that in mind. They're not all 3 acres. There's a lot that are much smaller and a few that are much bigger. Total production in 2019 was 1,600 tons of grapes, and on average, we're getting about 3.8 tons per acre of grapes, which is a decent yield, and we'll talk about some of the limitations that we have to growing grapes in a little bit. On average, grapes sell for about $1,500 per acre. I mentioned the growth that our industry is experiencing. So we have data all the way back to 1984, and you can see how the vineyard acreage has increased. Not all the data is in for the most recent years here, but the estimate is that we actually have about 800 acres, as I mentioned previously. And in terms of how much is produced, and so if you look at the past 5 years, we've produced almost 2,000 tons of grapes. But if you look at 2014 and the years before that, you can see that there were some years where not much was produced, and a large part of that is due to cold damage. So we'll talk about that as one of our limitations later in the presentation. In the entire state, we have about 170 licensed wineries. This does include cideries and meaderies. Due to their alcohol content, they're technically considered wine, but we do have about 20 cideries and 12 meaderies. On the left, you can see a map of our state, and all of the colored blocks indicate where grapes are grown. So like I said, we're growing grapes not only on the western slope here, but down in Montezuma County and Cortez and Canyon City, just to highlight a few areas out of the way. I pointed some arrows at 2 particular regions, the Grand Valley AVA and the West Elks AVA. AVA stands for American Viticultural Area, and this is a federal designation, so they can slap that on their bottle, saying that they specifically come from this region. So that's where, in those 2 AVAs and counties, so that's Mesa County and Delta County, they account for more than 90% of grape production for our state. So looking at this map, it looks like there's a lot of regions that grow grapes, but we're really focused in on that Grand Valley region and the West Elks region for more than 90% of our grapes. Now, what makes Colorado unique? Colorado isn't usually the first state that comes to people's minds when they're thinking about grape growing. Grapes can be grown anywhere between 4,000 and 7,000 feet in elevation here in Colorado, and there's not many countries that grow grapes higher than that. One of them is Argentina. Another unique thing about growing grapes here in Colorado, especially on the western slope, is the amount of sunshine that we receive. More than 300 days of sun each year really helps ripen all the grapes as well as all the fruit grown in the Grand Valley region. Also, we're known for having more alkaline soils as opposed to acidic soils that are commonly found in regions such as Napa Valley or in France. And another interesting fact is that because of our dry climate, we have a pretty low pest and disease pressure. So I like to think it makes it a little easier to be an extension agent, because if someone has a problem, we can pretty much narrow it down to just a few things, because we're not like some of the grape growing regions in Oregon or the East Coast that are really humid and moist and have a lot more pests and diseases. You might be wondering which varieties we are known for growing. And so we have quite a variety of varieties that we grow here. The number one, or the highest, most planted varieties include Cabernet Sauvignon, Merlot, Riesling, and Cabernet Franc. Looking at this pie chart on the left, you might be thinking that there's a large category that's considered other, and you might be wondering what that is. And that's largely comprised of hybrid varieties. And so the majority of what we're looking at here are Vitis vinifera European varieties, but we do grow some hybrid varieties which aren't spelled out here, but we'll talk about that in a little bit. I wanted to take a second and just talk about the people that we have working with and on grapes in Colorado. So like I said, my name is Miranda, and I do the extension side of things. I do lots of outreach. And then we have Dr. Horst Kasperi, who is the professor with CSU and also the state viticulturalist. His focus is research. He does research on a number of things, and he's been here for 20 years, so he has a wealth of information. But he studies which varieties grow best in Colorado, which management practices to use, such as which cover crops to plant or how to train your vine and how to deal with a number of different pests and diseases. So there's our contact information for both of us. And the next two parts of this series will be led by Dr. Horst Kasperi, so you'll be hearing plenty from him in the coming weeks. Here I wanted to pull up the research page that Horst has with a lot of his data, and this is just a great place to go if you have questions. There's some statistics on the most recent. He does a survey each year just figuring out how many vineyards are out there, how many people are growing grapes and which varieties. So a lot of what I talked about previously are from that survey. And then there's a lot of information on the research trials that he's running. You can just click on that research report tab and you can find out a lot of information there. Both Horst and I are located at the Western Campus with Colorado State University. This was formerly known as the Orchard Mesa Research Center in Grand Junction. And so this Western Campus now houses not only the Ag Experiment Station and the Forestry Service, but also Extension, which is why I'm housed there as well. And you can just see we have a beautiful view of the Book Cliffs right over the vineyards that are used in a lot of Horst's studies. But I also wanted to point out that we do have vineyards in other locations throughout the state, such as the Fort Collins region and in Rogers Mesa. So there's a number of different trials going on in those locations as well. In terms of the extension position, my job description is to increase resources and educational opportunities for wine grape growers across the state with the goal of improving the quality of Colorado wine grapes. And this involves conducting seminars, workshops, and different types of training materials, also producing educational materials such as fact sheets and videos and informative videos. Also, a large part of what I do is take that research that Horst has been doing and help relay that information to growers or help them put it in perspective for their particular vineyard or their potential vineyard. And then I also conduct site visits to individual vineyards and provide consultation to growers. Before we get into some of the limitations that we do experience with grape growing here in Colorado, I wanted to just walk through the life cycle of the grapevine. And we're going to start with winter. So this is when the vine is in its dormant state. You can see there's no green growth. We have our old growth trunk with two arms going out. And then pretty soon in the Grand Valley, we will begin to experience, if we're not already, spring budding. And so you can see the beginning of shoots all along that one-year-old growth of the vine. This is what is going to grow and produce our fruit the coming year. So grapevines have a 2-year life cycle. These buds that are along the one-year-old wood will each produce a shoot that fruits next year. So as those continue to grow, we'll start to see inflorescences, which are the little dots, and this is considered once these bloom, and that's a transition from there being flowers on inflorescences to there being berries on what will become clusters. So bloom is a very important time to keep track of. The growth will continue and our canopy will become full, and this is when the vine transitions from focusing on its vegetative growth, and now it'll focus on the reproductive growth, or those clusters. So right now they're not ripe, but we'll start to focus on ripening, and veraison is the point at which 50% of the berries are colored or ripe, and 50% are not. So that's another important point, another important time period when it comes to the life cycle of the grapevine. As ripening continues, we will be ready to harvest when they're fully ripe. And then after harvest, the leaves will change color and then they will eventually fall off, and that'll bring us back to our winter dormancy state. So I just wanted to walk through the life cycle of the grapevine. And then we're going to talk about a few limitations that grapes do experience here in Colorado. The first and most important one being cold hardiness. We are growing grapes in a cold region that takes a little bit of work in order to help the vines grow. And so avoiding winter damage involves a number of things, including the selection of your site, the cultivar that you grow, and management techniques that you use. So we'll talk about cold hardiness. And then phylloxera is not necessarily a limitation, it's just an issue that we're having to deal with. All grape growing regions have dealt with phylloxera or will eventually deal with it, and it's just our time to deal with it now. So I'll touch on what phylloxera is and how it's affecting our vineyards. First, I wanted to bring up a graph of temperature over the course of the last year, because this is extremely important when it comes to the conversation of cold hardiness. And we're not only talking about how cold the grapes can withstand in January and February when they're most cold hardy, but you can see in the bottom right-hand corner, in October, we had cold events that actually cost a lot of fruit in the research trials and in a lot of vineyards across the state. And so it's important to keep in mind that the shoulder seasons, such as fall and spring, are really important to keep your vines protected from the cold. Here is an image of the estimated number of freezing years in a decade for European grapes grown in Colorado. So this is from a study that Horst is conducting to determine if there are some other places that we should explore planting grapes throughout the state. And so the dark blue are regions that will experience a killing frost in 10 out of 10 years. So it would not be advised to plant grapes in these regions. And again, this is for European grapes, the typical varieties that you think of, such as Merlot, Cabernet Sauvignon, Chardonnay. But if you look at the Grand Valley in the left-hand corner, we're getting down to the 0 or 1 or 2 years, and within a decade that you would experience a killing frost. And so this can give you an idea of, if you're located somewhere and you're considering growing grapes, how much cold damage you would be up against. And like I mentioned, the Four Corners region is pretty promising if you can find a good spot, as well as Canyon City there south of Denver. The first thing you want to keep in mind when you're trying to prevent cold damage is site selection. So cold air typically occupies the lowest 20 to 30% of a slope. So if you have a slope located on your property, you do not want to plant vines at the bottom of it, because that's where the cold air will settle, and it can be a lot colder than the mid region of the slope, which is the optimal place to plant a vineyard, the most suitable place. So after site selection, you can decide which varieties you want to grow. I've been talking about Vitis vinifera, or our European varieties, and those are known to be cold hardy down to -5 degrees Fahrenheit. And we're talking midwinter temperatures there. Again, we do have to keep in mind those shoulder seasons, how they acclimate and deacclimate to cold. We do have American varieties as well, which are, I spelled American wrong there, but they are native to the United States. And so they are more cold tolerant than those European varieties. And those can tolerate up to -20 degrees Fahrenheit. And then hybrids are a mix between those European varieties and the American varieties, and they have more of a range of cold hardiness, anywhere between -10 to -30 degrees Fahrenheit. So if you are considering planting a vineyard, what's recommended is to get a temperature sensor and set it out on your property over the course of an entire year, especially the winter months, but also the spring and fall, to determine how cold it gets on your site, and that'll give you an idea of which varieties you can consider planting. This is a similar graph, but now we are showing the estimated killing years in a decade for specifically hybrids. So these are known to be more cold hardy. As you can see, we have more of the yellow and green colors here, especially on the east side of the state and the southeast. So this gives you an idea of, if you're in one of these regions and you're considering growing grapes, maybe think about growing these hybrids. So we talked about site selection and cultivar selection, but there are even more things that you can do. The pruning technique that you use, and whether you double prune your vine, that can help prevent cold damage. Also, you can maintain multiple trunks, and then you have a better chance of your vine surviving. We'll talk about phylloxera next, but that results in graft unions, and it's important to protect those graft unions from the cold. And then you can also work with wind machines and irrigation techniques to modify the external temperature to help protect your vines. So it's not impossible to grow vines in Colorado. We just have to keep a lot of these things in mind to protect the vines from the cold.
Oh,
there's a great
Miranda, we have a question real fast.
Sure.
Are there wine-making varieties which also make good table grapes?
Wine grapes usually have seeds in them, so if they were table grapes that you were going to be eating, it probably wouldn't be ideal. So winemakers like those seeds because they add tannins and other flavors into the wine, but when you're just eating a handful of grapes, that probably wouldn't be the best. But if you don't mind spitting out seeds, then yeah, definitely. Wine grapes also have a thicker skin, again, for the same reason. They add more flavor to the wine, and so if you don't mind thick skins and seeds, then I guess it could work. This is a great resource on Forst's page. You can get here the same way, but what this is testing a number of varieties to determine how cold hardy they are at all points throughout the season. So this is really important for those spring and fall time points when you don't know how acclimated or deacclimated your grape is. So you can find whatever variety you're interested here on the left, and you can see when it had been tested most recently. So most recently, it might have been updated since I added this to the presentation, but the 26th of March. And you can see what temperature killed 50% of the buds in this middle column, and which temperature killed 90%, and also which temperature killed 10%. So this gives you a great idea of which temperatures to be worried about and when you might consider implicating some of those management practices to protect your vine. And this is some similar data. Here's the curve of grapevine cold hardiness. In the red and blue, we have the max and minimum temperatures throughout the year. So the middle of our graph here is January, February, midwinter. And then these green and white dots are the cold hardiness tests that have been run. So these green and white signals how cold hardy the grapes are. So if we were to see an intersection between that minimum temperature and the hardiness of the vine, that's when you would expect some damage to occur. So that's what we're on the lookout for with this type of information. And this is also available on Horst's webpage. Another one of the issues that we deal with in Colorado is phylloxera. What is phylloxera? It is a microscopic aphid-like insect that feeds on grapevine roots. It also has a form that feeds on the leaves, but most common form feeds on the roots. So you can't see it, and it does eventually result in vine death, but that's not immediate. Symptoms of phylloxera include weak growth or the appearance of poor nutrition. And what's unique about phylloxera is its spreading pattern. So it feeds on the roots, like I just said, but once it's finished feeding on one particular vine, it'll transition to the neighboring vines to feed on their roots once all the nutrients are out of the first vine. So in the image here on the right, you can see some circular shapes in the vineyard that look like they're not as vigorous or healthy as the surrounding vines. So this is indicative of phylloxera infestation in this vineyard. Another reason that phylloxera is such a big issue is because it's very easily transported. It can be transported on plant material, so if you're planting a new vineyard, you have to be careful of where you order your plant material and make sure that it is phylloxera free. It can also just simply be transported on footwear, so if you have workers coming through your vineyard or visitors coming through, they can transfer it from one vineyard to another. Also equipment such as tractors or harvest bins. It's because for this reason that since phylloxera was detected in Colorado in 2015, it has now spread to more than 24 cases throughout the state, or 24 vineyards throughout the state.
We got another question, Miranda, kind of back to the grape varieties. Is there a grape variety recommended for canning jellies? Are there certain characteristics to look for?
Canning jellies and jams, a popular or a well-known variety that comes to mind is the Concord grape. So your Welch's grape juice or grape jelly that you get at the store is a Concord grape. I can definitely get a list of other varieties that would be well suited to canning. One thing that's important is the sugar content. That's the thing that you're most looking for. So if whoever asked that question, I can get you some more information. When we're talking about phylloxera, it's those European varieties that are susceptible. The phylloxera feeds on their roots. Phylloxera can also be found in the American varieties that I mentioned and the hybrids, but they are not detrimental to the growth. The whole European industry was wiped out after phylloxera was brought from America to Europe because our American species have evolved with phylloxera, so they are able to withstand it. This is another good reason to consider planting hybrid varieties because they can deal with phylloxera. It's not gonna kill off the vines. But if you do want to plant those European varieties, you simply would want to use a rootstock. So the rootstock would be of an American variety that can withstand the insect, and then your scion or the rest of your vine would be the variety of your choice. So 85% of vines in Colorado are planted on those European roots, and that's why this is a huge problem because they're going to have to be replanted eventually, either with the hybrid varieties or with rootstocks of those American species. I wanted to take a few minutes to talk about a few of the partners that we have here in the grape industry in Colorado. The Colorado Wine Industry Development Board, also known as the CWIDB, is a sector of the Colorado Department of Agriculture, and their goal is to encourage and promote agricultural and enological research and experimentation. They're a great resource to go to, and they do a lot of marketing for the Colorado wine industry. They are located in Broomfield. Also, we have CAVE, or the Colorado Association for Viticulture and Enology. And they are a private independent trade association located in Palisade, and I can put a link to their website where you can consider being a member. They have a lot of great perks and resources for their members. Here, might just take a second to load, are just some ways that you can stay up to date and involved in what's going on in Colorado in terms of the grape industry. If you type in Colorado Grape Growers on Facebook, you can ask to join our group where you'll be updated with webinars such as this when they're coming, other upcoming events such as the VINCO conference in January that CAVE puts on, and then lots of information from other people. I think it's just a great way for grape growers to connect across the state. We also have viticulture.colostate.edu is a website where you can find out a lot of similar information, such as announcements and upcoming events, but there's also a tab here in the middle that links to some videos and webinars that have been recorded and will be recorded. So this is a great way to find out information on how to prune and different ways to prune different types of vines. And then lastly, I send out a weekly newsletter, and at this point, if you would like to be added, feel free to add your email address in the chat box, or you can email me specifically. My email address will be at the end of our presentation here in a few minutes. But you can find out about upcoming events and research updates pertaining to the grape industry, both in Colorado and across the country and the world. And there's lots of ways you can stay involved with the Wine Board and CAVE. So this is a great way to stay up to date with what we're doing. Also, I wanted to highlight a few resources that we have. If you're considering growing grapes, we do have a Colorado Grape Growers Guide that has a lot of great information. Feel free to contact me as well, because there's some updates that I can talk to you about that haven't been included in that publication. And then if you're interested in the economic side of things, we also, of course, help produce the cost of growing wine grapes in Western Colorado to give you an idea of what types of equipment you should expect to have and how much it will cost and what the returns will be on planting and running a vineyard. I wanted to make sure everyone was aware that this is part of a 3-part series, and it'll be the next 2 Tuesdays, the same time, 10 a.m., and you'll click on the same Zoom link. Part 2 next week will be How to Grow Grapes in Colorado, led by Dr. Horst Kasperi. And the following week will be Troubleshooting Grapes in Colorado, so this will focus on pests and diseases. So we look forward to seeing you over the course of the next 2 weeks. And I just wanted to say thank you, and I would welcome any questions you might have. And again, you can see my email address there if you're interested in being part of the newsletter, or if you just have any questions that you'd like to email me about. Thank you.
Awesome. We just had a question come through. Is this series primarily focusing on wine varieties versus table grapes?
Yes. But we do have a table grape trial going on in Rogers Mesa. It is in its preliminary stages, so there hasn't been any yield information yet, but I can get you in contact with the folks down there if you have some specific questions about particular varieties that grow best. So yeah, if you're interested in table grapes, just feel free to shoot me an email and I'll get you the information that we have.
Awesome. And when is the best time of year to prune grapes?
Pruning grapes, in theory, can happen anytime when the vine is dormant. But in our situation, when we're worried about cold and frost, it's best to wait as late as possible and do it right before the buds start growing in spring. So right around this time is when they're starting to grow. So if you haven't pruned yet, now would be a great time. Or if you're in a little bit of a warmer area, maybe last week or the week before. Because when the vines get pruned, they're actually more susceptible to cold. So we want to push that off as late as possible. So March and April are, in general, the time to prune grapes in Colorado, but depends on where you're located and which varieties you have. So feel free to shoot me an email if you have more of a specific question.
Awesome. Do you think the backyard growers will benefit from this series?
I think you definitely will learn more about grapevines, and there'll be information on how much you should be watering your grape, if you should fertilize it, maybe consider getting a soil test So I don't think it would be a waste of time at all. It's probably more geared toward commercial growers, but I don't think that means that backyard growers won't learn anything, especially the pest and disease seminar number 3, 2 weeks from today. If you ever get a disease or an insect on your grape and you're wondering what it is, I think that would be a great session to tune into.
Awesome. This is what I was curious about too. Michelle asks, how do you identify the variety of grape you have growing? She bought it from Home Depot and it was labeled grape.
Oh, that's pretty tricky to do. We can start by looking at the shape and the size of the leaves, and then obviously if it's a red grape versus a white grape, if it has seeds or not, we can take all this into consideration. It's really hard to narrow it down to exactly which specific variety that you have, but I can definitely help you get a better idea of what you're working with. Yeah, I'm gonna leave it at that, so feel free to shoot me an email.
Maybe send you some photos and describe the grapes and stuff. Awesome. What are the water requirements in general for the American varieties?
For the American varieties, I believe Horst will touch on this next week for some more details, but I believe in the summer, just in general, you should plan on watering your grapes 1 inch per week. Horst can correct me if I'm wrong. And I'm not sure if there's a huge difference between the European and the American varieties when it comes to that irrigation, but to give you another idea, usually grapes require about half the amount of water that your typical lawn would require. So if this is a backyard grape and you're watering your lawn, think about watering your grape about half as much.
Okay. And then I think this will come up later. Will organic pesticides be discussed in the future? So probably during part 3, the troubleshooting with the pesticides. I'm guessing
Horst
so.
might be talking about them. Yeah, my guess would be yes.
My guess would be yes. Are grape blooms pollinated with honeybees or other pollinators?
They are not. Grapevines are considered self-pollinated, but what that really means is just the wind blows because the flowers are hermaphrodites, so they have both the male and female parts. So the pollen from the male part fertilizes the female part. So they do not need honeybees. I don't think they would hurt them.
Awesome. And when you do a soil test, what criteria are most important for determining suitability? I think the Horst will get into this next week too, but do you want to give some generalities?
Nitrogen is the most important nutrient when it comes to grapevines. However, the soils, at least in the Grand Valley, are usually pretty rich in nitrogen, so it's not too much to worry about. One thing you want to be on the lookout for is your pH and the salt content. We have pretty high salt content, especially on the western slope, and that can inhibit grape growth. So pH, salt content, and then nitrogen. But yes, stay tuned. Next week we'll go more in depth on that.
Awesome. Anybody else have any questions? Thanks for getting me your emails for the mailing list.
Yes, I'm out of Pueblo. I'm not using the Zoom video. Miranda, can you actually state your email address so we can contact you?
Sure, of course. It is, I'll just say it first and then I'll spell it. Miranda.ulmer@colostate.edu. So that is MIRANDA.ULMER@COLOSTATE.edu.
Perfect, thank you.
You're welcome.
Great. Are we ever going to discuss any container planting of grapes? Or do you have any guidance on that?
I don't think we'll be discussing it, but and I don't know anything that I would say off the top of my head, but I'd be more than happy to look into specific management practices specifically for container grapes. So feel free to shoot me an email and I can get you some more information on that.
Okay. We are getting ready to start grapes this season. What are good trellises?
The trellis that you want to choose largely depends on which variety that you're growing. So I've been talking about European and American varieties, and they do have different growing habits. For example, the European varieties grow upwards as opposed to the American ones grow down. So you would have a different trellis for each of those systems. So if you're able to determine which type of growing habit your grape has, then I would recommend a vertically shoot position vine for the European varieties and a high top wire cordon vine for the American ones. But I can definitely send you more details on each of those systems and how to set up the trellis and how to train the grape in these early years in order to get it situated. So please shoot me an email and I'll get you lots of more information on trellis systems.
Okay, Denny asks, what pH do grapes like?
I don't even know off the top of my head, but we have more alkaline soils, and so I believe it's between 7 and 8, but I don't know if Horst can chime in here.
I might chime in. A very wide range where we can grow the grapes on pH soil. We don't want to be below 5. 4 or 5 would probably be the absolute lowest minimum. And, we can grow them as high as maybe 8.5. But with each of those, extreme pH ranges come certain influences on nutrients. So when you get into very low pH, you're starting to get into aluminum toxicity and other things. Other micronutrients might become toxic. You go into the very high pH, other nutrients might become toxic. So you have to address that. But the range is very wide. So you're looking at, at least a 4 pH, 4 unit range in pH that you can grow grapes in.
Thank you, Horst.
Awesome. Yeah, we have some time to answer some more questions if anyone has any, keeping in mind that there's obviously going to be 2 more parts to the series. So some of them we might get to next week. Awesome.
Thank you so much, Christine, for having me on. It's always a pleasure working with you, and this has been fun.
Yeah, it's been awesome. So I have that email list that people have been sending in the chat box. We just got one more question. What is the lifespan of a vine that is well taken care of? Are some varieties that live longer than others?
Grapes can live for a very long time, hundreds of years. I've heard that in a commercial setting, you might consider replanting your vineyard after about 40 years, but if we're talking backyard grape, you can expect it to last for as long as you would like, especially if it's well maintained. And I don't know if there's a large difference based on variety of the lifespan. I think it's all around the same area. It just depends on the climate and how well it's managed.
And then how long do they take to get established?
Great question. Typically, we consider a vine to be at its production capacity at about 4 years. So after you plant it, you can expect to see some fruit in year 3, but might be smaller clusters or smaller yields. So year 4 is when we expect it to be, or we determine it to be fully grown.
Gotcha. Maggie wants you to talk a little bit about pruning, which I'm pretty sure that Horst is going to get to this next week, but kind of in general, talk about pruning.
Sure. So again, we're doing this during the dormant period of the grapevine growth. And the main idea with pruning is working with the 1-year-old wood. So grapevines produce fruit on 1-year-old wood, so the wood that grew last year. As I went through the life cycle of the grapevine, you can see the buds that grow 1 year produce fruit the next year. So when you're pruning your vine, you're just trying to figure out which buds to keep and how many buds to keep. And then we keep in mind the fact that each of those buds will produce a shoot that will have fruit on it. So if you have a vine that's never been pruned before, Christine and I actually just created a video on how to go about it, and that will be sent out in the newsletter, and we'll give you access to that. And then if you're talking about more of a commercial setting, there are 2 main methods of grapevine pruning, and feel free to contact me if you want more information, and I think Horst will touch on it a little bit more next week as well.
Cool. Is high wind damaging to vines?
It definitely can be. It can alter the way that it grows. If you have a normal trellis, sometimes you see vines that are all gnarled one way because of the wind. It can also break off shoots and then cause them to not produce as much fruit or as quality of fruit. So yes, wind can be damaging.
And Michelle asks, we'll probably touch on this in a future webinar, but once a vine gets a disease, does it have to be destroyed, or can you do something to fix it? Or
Sure,
will it come up just fine the next year?
It depends on what disease it is, whether it can overwinter and affect the grape year after year, or if it'll die off each winter. But either way, there's probably some pesticides or organic options that you can use to apply on the vine and take care of that disease, or different management methods that you can use for preventing the disease from affecting your vine in the future, such as removing the leaves to open up the canopy and not have such a optimal environment for diseases.
Okay, I think we'll take one last question and then we'll save more fun for the future. I read that watering vines prior to a freeze protects them. Is that true?
If we're talking about watering the ground, I'm not sure, but irrigation can be used in the middle of a freeze. So if you do turn on your irrigation before a freeze is expected and continue irrigating until the temperature warms back up again, it can, the water in contact with the vine and specifically the bud can help keep the bud right at 32 degrees Fahrenheit as opposed to going lower. This is only recommended if the temperature is expected, I think, anywhere between 24 and 32. You don't want to do this if the temperature is expected to go lower than 24 degrees, because then it could really damage your vine. So yes, irrigation can be used, but it can only be used under specific circumstances, or else it could do even more damage. So if you have more specific questions on that, feel free to contact me and we'll get you that information.
Okay, great. Well, thank you to everybody for tuning in, and hopefully we see you all on here next week. And yeah, in the meantime, go ahead and send your questions to Miranda.
Yeah.
Thanks, everybody.